And he commanded these three main generals in front of all people, so there were quite a few who heard him, deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains charge concerning Absalom. And that's important to know for later. But so you can see where David's heart is. He knows that he's got to fight in order to keep his kingdom. That's God's will. God chose David to be king. God did not choose Absalom. Although I think he might have still been wondering if that's how God would work because of what David had done. And God had promised David that his sons would sit on the throne. So there might have been a little bit of a question in David's mind if it would be him or Absalom. But he cared about his son. But I think David, hi Mona. I think David had a blind spot where maybe all his children were concerned, but especially where Absalom was concerned. He hadn't realized that Absalom was building a kingdom back when Absalom would stay at the gate of Jerusalem and say, "Oh, you should come to me because I would help you." Yeah, Absalom had been working at this for a while, and I think David didn't want to believe that Absalom would actually do this.
And he had to have heard about it. He had to know
yes.
that this was going on.
Right. And so he just didn't want to believe that about his son. Absalom was a traitor, a murderer. He was rebellious towards God, toward his father. And so David was concerned about his life. And we understand that. Let me see. It's interesting. One of the commentaries, I liked what he said. His final words to his troops as they went out are not an exhortation toward victory, but rather an order on how his rebel son should be treated once captured. The king, seemingly oblivious to his son's treason, longs to see him again. So he's having a conflict right now between being a king and being a father. And we understand that, but he needs to be a king. So,
well, and even as a father, he wasn't doing correct by this son.
Right, he wasn't. All right, and just keep in mind too, so we know that the three captains for sure, generals, whatever you want to call them, Ittai, Abishai, Joab, they heard David say, "Deal gently," and we don't read in scripture that they said anything. So, but we know that at least one of them had other ideas in mind, and that was Joab. I think Joab, if he had been honest, he should have said something to David at that point, but he didn't. So, in 2 Samuel 18:6, then the army marched out to the field to fight against Israel. So Israel is how they're describing Absalom's army. And then the army is David's, of course. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. And this is a place we're not real sure where it is because it's not mentioned any other time. The army of Israel was defeated there by David's men. And the writer of this book doesn't go into detail at all about the battle. He just said, okay, here's a battle. He led up to the battle in great detail. And now he said, okay, and so now David's men were victorious over Absalom's men. The slaughter there was great that day. 20,000 soldiers were killed. The battle there was spread out over the whole area. Oh, I'm sorry. I had another translation here. Sorry. I meant to stay with King James. And the forest consumed more soldiers than the sword devoured that day. Now that is interesting.
What does that mean?
I looked into that, and I'm not sure except, well, they could have gotten lost. There was a pit around nearby that they threw Absalom's later on threw his body in. So maybe there were other pits, and Absalom got stuck in a tree. Maybe it was overgrown. Maybe it was a forest that was overgrown, at least in places. And there were wild beasts too that lived in those places. And so But I think the neatest thing about that is God controlled the forest. God controlled it. And so for the forest to claim more than the sword did, to me that says God did that. For the battle there, verse 8, was scattered over the face of all the country, and the wood devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Again, we're not sure what that means, but it devoured, which in other words, it killed. And Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule. And the mule, and just let me stick right in there. I didn't realize this before, but and let me give you a couple of verses. Riding a mule was a sign of royalty. And I thought, I could see that about a horse, but a mule? In 2 Samuel 13:29, it mentions that all the king's sons arose, and every man gat him up upon his mule and fled. So all the king's sons had mules. And then in 1 Kings 1:33, the king also said to them, take with you, this is later on, with you the servants of your Lord, and cause Solomon my son to ride upon mine own mule and bring him down to Gihon. So it was a sign of royalty to be on a mule.
I wonder if that's why that's what Jesus rode into Jerusalem.
Maybe. Yes, I hadn't thought of that. But that's a good indication, because evidently it was. And you can, those verses to me explain it. And so Absalom was on a mule. You know, if he had not been on this mule, he would have probably gotten away. So, but he had some pride going on there. Okay. And so, let me see, verse 17. No, let's start in verse 9. Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak. And his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up between the heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away.
That was a sight to see.
I know. The only thing I've seen it in movies, and it's almost funny how the mule just, you can see him going on, and Absalom is left hanging there. And it doesn't ever say this, but it's a pretty safe assumption to say it's probably his hair that he got caught.
He had lots of hair.
Yeah, he had lots of hair. And, back it was 2 Samuel 14:26, it talks about Absalom's hair. Why would it tell us about his hair? I think he's preparing us for the fact that his hair is his downfall. And he was so proud of that hair.
And you'd think, I don't know what word to use, ending for a man so full of pride.
Yeah.
To be left hanging in an oak tree by his hair.
Yeah.
Right.
It certainly wasn't very glorious.
Humiliating.
Yes, yes.
Karen.
That's true. I didn't think of that. It says, cursed is the man who hangs from it. Hangs from a tree. In 2 Samuel 14:26, when he pulled his head, for it was at every year's end that he pulled it, because the hair was heavy on him, therefore he pulled it. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels after the king's weight. And it was conjectured it was 5 or 6 pounds. That's a lot of hair. Feel kind of sorry for him, but okay.
Not really.
Yeah. Then verse 10. And a certain man saw it and told Joab. So this guy, one of the soldiers, he sees Absalom hanging in a tree. And so he tells Joab and says, behold, I saw Absalom hanged in an oak. And Joab said unto the man that told him, and behold, thou sawest him, and why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? And I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver and a girdle. And the man said unto Joab, though I should receive 1,000 shekels of silver in mine hand, yet would I not put forth mine hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged thee and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware that none touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise I should have wrought falsehood against mine own life, for there is no matter hid from the king, and thou thyself would have set thyself against me. So, first of all, he doesn't do anything about Absalom. If David had not said that, he probably would have. But so he goes to tell Joab, and Joab said, well, why didn't you kill him? Well, and this guy explains, well, we all heard. And okay, what this guy says to Joab indicates several things. One, that he understands that it would get back to David. And he doesn't want to be the one who killed David's son because of what David said. And then second, he doesn't feel like he could be safe in assuming that Joab would have his back. Joab would probably throw him under the bus. And knowing Joab, I agree with him. I think Joab would have done that. So, and for Joab to say, well, you should have killed him, I'd give you such and such if you did, that would mean Joab wouldn't have to do it. So there were several reasons there that Joab, it shows us though that to me it says that Joab's character is pretty well known by his troops also. I do think Joab must have been a good commander as far as intelligent, skillful is a better word, because David's army was smaller, but David's army won. Now, I do think it's because of God, obviously, and because the forest devoured more than the sword did. So God was definitely at work there, but also Joab was skillful. And so, any ideas, any thoughts there? Verse 14, then said Joab, I may not tarry thus with thee. So in other words, he's tired of talking to that guy. And he took 3 darts in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom, while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men that bare Joab's armor compassed about and smote Absalom and slew him. So let's stop for a minute there. You know, even though Absalom was a rebel, he had bad intentions. He was going to take the kingdom. He'd already almost done that. He intended to kill David, so he was not a good guy at all. I can totally understand Joab's reasons for killing him. But this was the same guy that Joab went to Geshur on behalf of David after telling David, bring him back. He went to Absalom and brought him back. So he was related to Absalom. They were cousins, first cousins. And so he'd known Absalom since he was probably I don't know how old Joab was. He could have been older than David, or he could have been David's age. We don't know. But he would have known Absalom real well. And remember, Absalom would always go to Joab saying, go to my dad and tell him, he hasn't seen me for 2 years. I might as well have stayed in Geshur. And of course, Joab didn't do anything at first, and Absalom set his field on fire. So then he came right over there and said, what are you doing? Well, so there's a lot of interaction between Joab and Absalom. For Joab just to be able just to walk right up to him and kill him, that kind of got me. Yeah, it is cold. It shows me what kind of man Joab was. Even though I have to say, I think it was God's will for Absalom to be killed. And it's because of Absalom's heart. It's like God knew he was too hard. He was not going to repent. He was not going to turn. But I have to think, God allowed Joab to kill Absalom, but was Joab correct in doing that, do you think? It was war.
But David had said to deal gently with him. He could have captured him without him.
Yes, he definitely could have. His was the choice to make. And he deliberately disobeyed David. And he could have thought, well, David's not thinking correctly. This is his son. He's going to make a big mistake, and Absalom's going to be a problem. Well, let's get rid of him. And I'm sure that's part of why he killed him.
I'm sure too. I feel like it is probably. It's just.
But it's just
Really should have talked that over with David though.
Yeah, of course, David.
Kind of
Yeah.
the fence was hanging from the tree.
Right.
You know, and it wasn't like they were going hand in hand to combat, you know,
Yeah.
him or him. Yeah.
Right.
It wasn't
And
self-defense.
I have to say, it reminds me, there's some similarities between the time that Saul and his men were in the cave and David and his men were in that cave. And, you know, David definitely could have seen that as his men tried to get him to see it as God's provision. Hey, here's your enemy, get rid of him. I think there could have been good reason for David to kill Saul at that time, but David didn't. So I think you have the difference between David and Joab here. But the fact that, I mean, if he had been a stranger to Joab, I could have understood it a little bit better. But to be somebody that, and Joab just killed him. That was awful, I thought. Verse 14. No, I'm sorry, verse 16. So now Absalom is killed. Now there's no reason to continue this battle. Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing after Israel. For Joab held back the people. So in other words, now there's no reason to continue. He held them back because there's no reason for anyone else to get killed. And verse 17, and they took Absalom and cast him into a great pit in the wood, and it must have been nearby, and laid a very great heap of stones upon him, and all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. All Israel meaning Absalom's army. Remember that Joab heard David say, "Don't kill him," but we have to also remember that Absalom intended on killing David and wouldn't have hesitated. So Absalom kind of had the same heart as Joab, I think. Verse 18, now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and reared up for himself a pillar, which is in the king's dale, where he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and it is called unto this day Absalom's place. Well, that tells us a little bit more about Absalom's heart and the pride that was there. Now, Absalom did have 3 sons, according to 2 Samuel 14:7. So it's conjectured that they either died or somehow they didn't enter this picture. So this monument was intended as a burial place for him, for Absalom. Instead, he was thrown into a pit and covered with stones. We know from several other scriptures that this was a disgraceful way to bury someone. In Joshua 7 and Joshua 8, Joshua 7 describes Achan's burial. Remember, Achan was the one that stole some items from
They went into Jericho.
Yeah, was it Jericho that he did that? Anyway, he saw something, and God had said, destroy it all. And he didn't. He saved some silver and some clothing for himself.
Garments.
And they lost a battle because of that. And so once they found out it was Achan and God showed them it was, then he was thrown into a pit and covered with stones. And then also in Joshua 8, Ai's king, Ai being an enemy place, the king of Ai was an enemy, and they killed him, threw him into a pit and covered him with stones. So the fact that they did this to Absalom was a disgrace for him. So he wanted to be remembered, and he didn't have any sons. But he wasn't buried in the monument. He was buried in the middle of a forest, but he is remembered. Just not probably the way he would like to be remembered. Verse 19, then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, let me now run and bear the king's tidings, how that the Lord have avenged him of his enemies. And Joab said to him, thou shalt not bear tidings this day, but thou shalt bear tidings another day. This day thou shalt bear no tidings, because the king's son is dead. You know, sometimes you just look everywhere you can figure out as to what in the world these verses are talking about, and nobody knows. And so I don't know either, but but we can conjecture. Ahimaaz is a very loyal subject of David. He's the son of Zadok the priest. He was one of the two that were runners between Jerusalem and David when David had to leave. He's one of the ones he went down into the well and was hid. And God saved him so that he could go bring the tidings to David. So now he wants to go and tell David the good news. I think that's mainly what he loved David. He wanted to tell him that the battle is done. David doesn't have to run anymore. He can go back and be king, and it is good news. But Joab said, nope, you can't bring tidings to the king because the king's son is dead. Joab might have been a little concerned about how David would take the news. I'm not sure. Or he might have been concerned about what Ahimaaz might have said about him.
Probably more likely.
Yeah, probably more likely, I'm thinking too. So whatever reasons he had, he said, oh no, don't you go. And we don't know why Ahimaaz was so intent on running. Because Joab had someone picked out, a foreigner that was a runner, to go tell David the truth or the news. But verse 21 then said Joab to Cushi, go tell the king what thou hast seen. And Cushi bowed himself to Joab and ran. Then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, yet again to Joab, but howsoever, let me, I pray thee, also run after him. Cushi. And Joab said, wherefore wilt thou run, my son, seeing that thou hast no tidings ready? What that means, in the Amplified, Joab said, why should you run, my son, seeing you have no reward? So a runner evidently was given a reward for getting there quickly and giving the news. They would give them something. And I don't know why he said he would have no reward, but
maybe because the first guy was going to get.
Yeah, maybe so. Anyway, but Joab knew, in Joab's mind, why you're going to do this if you're not going to get a reward for it. Kind of shows you how Joab thinks. Anyway, verse 23. But howsoever, said he, let me run. So, he's pressing him to let him run. And so he said, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and overran Cushi. So he must have known. I wonder if he planned it. And this is given quite a few verses explaining all this. So might be something good for you to think about next week, and tell me your answer when you get here, when you come, because I just don't know what motivated Ahimaaz to do this.
When you're reading yours, you're reading this Cushi like it's somebody's name, and mine says the Cushite.
And it might be, I'm just reading you what mine says.
Yeah, different, but that's it. It's different.
And it could be. What translation do you have?
King James.
Yeah, this is King James.
I have King James too, and yours says different. Yours the New King James?
Yeah.
Okay,
This
mine
is the old.
Says the Cushite.
Yeah. Anyway, so we don't know if that was just because he was a Cushite or if his name was Cushi. We don't know. But he was a Cushite, and he was a foreigner. Mm-hmm. And so Joab might have thought, well, David's not going to hold him responsible, or get him, or Joab could have also thought if David gets mad and kills the messenger, at least it won't be Ahimaaz. Who knows?
Or maybe some people like to be the first to tell
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
And he loved David. We know that this guy Ahimaaz really did. He was very loyal to David. So he might have just been, like you said. Okay, verse 24. And David sat between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate unto the wall, and lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man running alone. And the watchman cried and told the king. And the king said, if he be alone, there is tidings in his mouth. And he came apace and drew near. So the watchman is watching. At first, this didn't make any sense to me either, but if the battle was being lost, probably there would be more people running towards David. That's what one commentary brought out, and that makes sense to me. If David's men were losing, they'd be running back, and there'd be just not just one. And the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called unto the porter and said, Behold, another man runneth alone. And the king said, He also bringeth tidings. So they didn't have cell phones in those days, and so he's thinking, okay, maybe this is just a messenger, not someone just running away from the battle. And the watchman said, Methinketh the running of the foremost is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And how he knew that? Ahimaaz must have had a reputation, or he must have a certain gait that was noticeable, but he was fast, which was a real plus in those days to be a runner for sure. And the king said, He is a good man and cometh with good tidings. Well, just because he's a good man doesn't mean he's coming with good tidings. I don't know what David was thinking. And Ahimaaz called and said to the king, All is well. I mean, he called out before he even got there. All is well. It's great, David. You can rejoice. He fell down to the earth upon his face before the king and said, Blessed be the Lord thy God, which hath delivered up the men that lifted up their hand against my lord the king. And so David should have been excited about that. And look what he says. Verse 29, and the king said, Is the young man Absalom safe? And Ahimaaz answered. Now, I think Ahimaaz had to have known. Because Joab, remember, he said, don't go tell him that it's not good news because the king's son is dead. So Ahimaaz knew. So now he's thought, maybe he didn't think it through, and now he's thinking, oh, now what am I going to say? Or maybe he planned on saying this all along. I don't know. When Joab sent the king's servant and me thy servant, I saw a great tumult, but I knew not what it was. And the king said to him, Turn aside and stand here. And he turned aside and stood still. And behold, Cushi came, and he said, Tidings, my lord the king, for the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them that rose up against thee. And the king said to Cushi, Is the young man Absalom safe? We can see where David's mind was, and we understand that. However, he had an army out there fighting for him. And it seems to me that he should have been thinking about them too. And Cushi answered, The enemies of my lord the king and all that rise up against thee to do thee hurt be as that young man is. So he knew. That was his way of saying the young man is dead. So for a king, the news should have been good, but for a father, David is crushed as a father. And I still think he didn't realize that Absalom actually, he needed to be dead. There was not any other way around it. And it was by Absalom's own choices that led to this. And we see the hand of God in this. Even God put Joab right there, because maybe because of David's command to everyone, deal gently, maybe no one else would have killed him but someone like Joab. Anyway, verse 33, and the king was much moved. And this word moved means to quiver with violent emotion, especially anger or fear. So he was so emotionally moved, and I can understand that.
Could you say that definition again?
To quiver with any violent emotion, especially anger or fear. Violent emotion. And I've seen this a couple of times. Some people react just when extremely bad news. It's just, this is a reaction that we have, our emotions. And David reacted in this way. And he went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went up, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. And he would have died for Absalom, in contrast to the fact that Absalom was going to kill him. So, but, in David's Psalms, even the ones he writes after this, we still see that he said God is a help in every bit of trouble that he has. So I know that David took this to God also, but the depth of his emotion and the just the strength of his emotion, this was going to have to be, this is going to, God needed to come in a mighty way, and he did. He came in for David. We know from David's Psalms later, but David still had to go through this. And you know, the man that he killed, Uriah, had a father. He had a wife. So David is reaping what he sowed.
You know, you think back about when the two sons of Aaron did it, and God said, don't. He wouldn't let them mourn in any way. You know, if you just think about it, and here David can just mourn.
Yes.
In some ways, all he wants. It's just because David's son was not really any different from those two sons of Aaron's that just
very similar.
did what God said not to do.
They rebelled against God. We don't see any place in Absalom's life that he wanted God's will at all.
I wonder if some of David's mourning isn't his own choices and not necessarily the son.
Oh, yes.
You know?
It all worked together in that. I do think that too.
You know, I think because if he wanted to die instead of Absalom, he would never have ran from him. You know, he would just kill him. So I think a lot of it is just knowing the inevitable is going to happen, but yet knowing that he was involved in that probably caused him great pain.
Yes, knowing that this was a reaping, knowing that this is partly his fault. Yeah. I can't remember the exact word that was used, but I think it was Gary Smalley or one of those guys that said about this verse, this is the voice of a father that didn't take care of his son. And it's true. In Proverbs 17:25, we read, a foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her that bare him. This is a real good example of that verse. And then we have to I keep saying it's his reaping, but I want to read this one more time, 2 Samuel 12:10-12. This is what God told David.
2 Samuel
12, 10-12. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house. Never. Because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. That's pretty strong words. Thou hast despised me. Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house. It would have been bad to have evil raised up against him from somebody else's house, but from his own. That was extra bad. And I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of his son. For thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. So God brings to pass what he says.
That's probably in the back of his mind, I would think.
Oh, I'm sure it was.
That's what God said to Eli, because you have put your sons before me,
yes,
and God took them out.
Yes, that's true. And now we're going to chapter 19, just the first few verses, because it goes right along with this story. I didn't want to stop in the middle. So in 2 Samuel 19, verses 1-8. And it was told Joab, behold, the king weepeth and mourneth for Absalom. So David is up in the chamber above the gate. I'm guessing that he wasn't quiet about his grief. It said he was crying loudly.
I don't think that was their way.
Right.
Anybody back then, probably.
So everyone could hear him up there just wailing. And so they're not going to come. It affects his army that's returning. And so someone told Joab about it. And the victory that day was turned into mourning unto all the people. For the people heard say that day how the king was grieved for his son. And the people got them by stealth that day into the city, as people being ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. So it compared the way they came back. It's like they were victorious and they came back and heard the king, and so they just kind of snuck into the city. And you can understand the way they're feeling now too. Here they fought hard and bravely, and they achieved victory, and they weren't able to rejoice because the king was in such sorrow. So verse 4, but the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Well, I can imagine what some of the people probably thought and felt, and Joab, one of the chief ones that thought this. You are just being torn up about Absalom, when Absalom was the kind of guy that was going to kill you and backstab you and take the throne of Israel. And, I can imagine what they all thought. So, in verse 5, and Joab came into the house to the king and said, "Thou hast shamed this day the faces of all thy servants, which this day has saved thy life, and the lives of thy sons and thy daughters, and the lives of thy wives, and the lives of thy concubines, in that thou lovest thine enemies and hatest thy friends. For thou hast declared this day that thou regardest neither princes nor servants. For this day I perceive that if Absalom had lived and we all had died this day, then it had pleased thee well. Now therefore arise, go forth, speak comfortably unto thy servants. For I swear by the Lord, if thou go not forth, there will not tarry one with thee this night. And that will be worse unto thee than all the evil that befell thee from thy youth until now." So Joab's just pretty peeved about this.
Every once in a while, he's right on.
Yeah, he is.
David needed this, to bring him out of it.
Yeah, he did, because he needed to be a king right now. And, in their culture and in the times, when a king would take the throne, if Absalom had taken the throne, one of the first orders of business would have been to kill anybody that was competition. And they did that because otherwise they would be dethroned probably by the next guy that thought he could do it. Just like Absalom himself was trying to dethrone David. And so Joab had a point there. In other words, David's still vulnerable. He was in Mahanaim, not Jerusalem. A lot of the Israelites, I don't know, it might have been a majority of them, had been for Absalom. And since Absalom was gone, what was to stop somebody else from stepping right in there? In fact, we do see that in chapter 20. Someone else does step in. So David can't afford to give way to his grief right now. He can't afford that because he's going to lose it still. And Joab, I was telling Mom, I don't know why Joab didn't just take the throne, because he had, he sure had the aggression and all that it would take to do that. But maybe he was wise enough to know that I don't think Israel would have followed him, because they knew what kind of man he was, as opposed to David, who was a good king and a just king. And you think about David. He listened to the widow that Joab gave her a lie to tell David to go get Absalom back before, and for David even to listen to her. Some kings, that's too beneath me. I don't have time for all of that. They wouldn't have even listened. I think David was a real good king, and we know that from verses that tell us that. But he needs to be a king now and not be a father. So it doesn't tell us that he says, and he responds at all to Joab, other than he gets up and goes down. And God did, I believe, like you said, God used Joab to say, David, it's time. It's time to get up and go down there and be a king. And now I do feel like Joab's attitude towards David, it shows real clearly here. And I'm sure I bet you anything, he went right in there and He didn't bow before him or anything. He just said, "You need to get down there right now." I'm sure. And maybe David would not have listened as much had he not said it that way. I don't know. But
Well, and you see somewhere Joab's heart was with the army.
Yeah.
Maybe more so than with David as king, but these men
Yeah.
were probably important to him.
Yes.
What they'd gone through. So
Yeah. And
if he needs an
every
excuse.
now and then Joab did kind of exhibit a few good points.
Which means he's a better military man. He'd have never made it as king.
Right. But he, like I said, I think he was a skillful commander. Any thoughts about this?
He could have had him killed if he wanted to.
Oh, right. He could have.
He must have known there was some truth.
Yes. Yes, I think he did too. I don't know why David put up with Joab all this time. I do not know. Unless he felt like because Joab was family, he couldn't get rid of him. Now he tried. Remember, he tried to he told Abner, "You can be the commander." And Joab took care of that real quick by killing Abner. Well, and we see the same thing in this next chapter for next week. We see David tries to get somebody else in there, and Joab kills him. So it's like, you're stuck with me, David. So I don't know.
So maybe he didn't deal any better with Abner than he did, with Joab than he did with his own kids.
Right. Maybe it's because
maybe this family thing is not all it's cooked up to be.
I don't know. It doesn't make sense because we see David act decisively in other matters and with other people and with other countries. When he's the victor, I mean, he just takes care of business.
Joab was a good leader.
It's true, he was.
And that's what David wanted.
That is true. And David needed a good leader. And maybe some of the other leaders, maybe Abner, I don't know. Abner was a leader too, but the other guy that he puts in, Amasa, we can see a little bit of weakness in him. I'll tell you about that next week.
Anything but weak.
Yeah, he was not weak, and that's true. He was a very good leader.
Worst times.
So maybe the two of them worked well together, even though Joab's heart was not after God, for sure. It wasn't. Joab's heart was after Joab. So in verse 8 we see, the king arose and sat in the gate. So, David he could have just given in to this, but he didn't. He saw the wisdom in what Joab was saying, and he sat in the gate. And they told unto all the people, saying, Behold, the king doth sit in the gate. And all the people came before the king, for Israel had fled every man to his tent. So Absalom's army had gone, and the people, meaning David's army, came. And so he was able to, I'm sure he comforted them and gave them appreciation for fighting for him. And so he had to just set aside his grief. And sometimes I think that's the best thing to do anyway, because when you get busy doing something else, it helps. So
sometimes we have to do that. I never read this without thinking about Sister Bodie, the leader of our Bible school, when she was teaching on this once, and she had a son who, as an adult, he died an alcoholic, and she of course thought of this, and she was bringing out how she had lost her son, and she was crying, and she says, "Oh, my son, my son." She probably felt a little responsible too for him being an alcoholic. I don't know, but it helped us to understand how David would have felt and how she felt, and we all have times like that.
Yeah. And sometimes it's okay to give in to our grief, but a lot of times we still have things to do.
We still have to take care of the situation.
Yeah, we have to go on. And especially a king, he had to go on. And the fact that he did, it just makes me think so much of David that he would be willing to do this. Because even though I don't know a better way to describe it, he made a mistake. a bad mistake. But, and he's reaping for it. But God didn't give up on him. And like I was saying on Wednesday night, I'm amazed at how much God loved David, how God praised David, how he said, this man obeyed me in everything except Uriah. And in one place it says in everything except the matter of Uriah. The other places it says he obeyed me in everything. So it was such a blessing to me to see David's heart after God. And God's going to take care of his heart, and we see that he will. But David still has some battles to fight, even to get back to Jerusalem. So I'm early, but I didn't want to go into the next part yet.
Think about, or just now when you were talking about all this thing in David's background, and yet David went on, and sometimes talk about the Apostle Paul. You see who had people sent to prison, maybe some died on his account. So he had to go on, leave that behind.
He had to, that could have defeated Paul right there and stopped everything. That was not God's intent.
Well, you think about that when he says, forgetting those things which are past.
That's true.
Yeah, if you don't, we're just done right there.
And David's going to have to forget these things too. And the people that stood against David, now we'll talk about this more later, but there's so many people that took up Absalom's cause. He can't kill all those people. That's not God's will. So he's going to have to do some forgiving. So, okay. Did you turn it off? Oh, you don't know how. Let's pass these out.
So it is kind of hard to sometimes think you only got one piece